It was the kind of political tremor that sent shockwaves across both conservative and liberal media in a matter of hours. The Senate chamber was tense, unusually so, as whispers swirled of a bold and unexpected move. Mitch McConnell, the long-serving Republican Senate leader, had reportedly been organizing behind closed doors, not just distancing himself from Donald Trump, but actively drafting a motion to explore impeachment charges tied to alleged, ongoing conduct unbecoming of a former president. The proposal stunned even McConnell's own allies. While he had made clear in the past that he held reservations about Trump's influence on the GOP, few expected such a direct attack. In hushed corridors and closed meetings, the strategy was described as an attempt to protect the party's future, to draw a hard line between traditional conservatism and what some insiders called the Trump cult of personality. As reporters scrambled to verify the leaks, one name unexpectedly began trending across social platforms: JD Vance. The Ohio senator, a former venture capitalist turned conservative firebrand, had remained silent for weeks but was known to be closely aligned with Trump. The moment the story broke, JD's team announced an emergency press conference. Cameras packed the room. The public expected a strong statement in Trump's defense. What they got instead was something far more explosive. JD Vance, with unshakable calm, stepped to the podium and began with 10 slow words. "If Mitch McConnell wants a fight, let's give him one." Then he held up a folder. The room fell dead silent. In his hand, JD Vance claimed, were documents and statements that could forever change how Americans viewed Mitch McConnell, not as the steely guardian of Republican discipline, but as a man whose political maneuvering had always come with a hidden cost. For years, JD began, voice steady but intense, "This man has told us he fights for conservative values. But when the cameras turn off and the doors close, Mitch fights for himself." A hush fell over the press pool. JD opened the folder slowly and began reading excerpts, not wild accusations, but direct records, funding agreements, old communications, even audio transcripts. One alleged memo described back-channel communications between McConnell's office and Democratic leadership during the early Trump presidency, discussing strategic media leaks to weaken populist influence. Another document detailed a decades-old lobbying agreement involving foreign corporate donors and tax loopholes McConnell allegedly promised to protect. The press scrambled to keep up. Within minutes, hashtags like #VanceLeaks and #McConnellExposed trended nationwide. McConnell's team released a brief, defiant statement calling the allegations a political hit job built on distortions. But JD wasn't finished. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "This is about truth. You want to cancel Trump? Then let's cancel the corruption that has infected this party for decades." Applause erupted from the crowd of supporters that had begun to gather outside. The damage was already done. JD had painted McConnell not just as a traitor to Trump, but a hypocrite to the entire conservative movement. And millions were now listening. Cable news exploded. Conservative outlets were caught in a storm of division, some condemning JD Vance for what they called party suicide, others hailing him as a truth-teller finally breaking the establishment's stranglehold. McConnell, long respected for his cold strategy and control of the Senate, suddenly looked vulnerable. Not because of policy, but because JD Vance had pierced the one armor Mitch had always worn flawlessly: silence. On morning shows and political panels, questions buzzed. Were the documents real? Could McConnell be investigated? Would Trump respond? The answer to the last came swiftly. Within 24 hours, Donald Trump issued a thunderous endorsement of JD Vance, calling him a warrior, a patriot, and the only one with the guts to say what we've all known for years. That statement alone was enough to send Republican leadership into disarray. Senators who had quietly supported McConnell began issuing soft statements calling for unity and a pause on intra-party attacks. But the cracks were visible. JD Vance, once viewed as the intellectual voice of the new right, had transformed overnight into a populist wrecking ball, and voters were responding. Calls flooded into conservative offices. Emails surged, and behind closed doors, McConnell's allies were beginning to whisper the unthinkable. Was his grip finally loosening? All the while, JD remained composed. He gave no interviews, refused to expand on the documents, and simply let the silence speak louder than spin. But it wasn't over. He had one more card to play, and he was saving it for live television. The day of the televised debate arrived with an electricity rarely felt in American politics. Scheduled as a forum between Republican voices on the direction of the party, it had now morphed into something entirely different, a showdown. Mitch McConnell, known for avoiding volatile media spectacles, had reluctantly agreed to appear, reportedly against the advice of several aides. JD Vance was already seated when Mitch entered the studio. Cameras rolled. The moderator's first question went straight to the point. "Senator McConnell, how do you respond to the accusations made against you by Senator Vance?" Mitch's face barely flinched. "Baseless," he said. "Senator Vance is exploiting innuendo to fracture the very party he claims to serve." JD leaned forward, hands clasped. "If it's all lies, Mitch," he said softly, "then you won't mind if I play this." He held up a small device. The producers froze. The moderator tried to interrupt, but JD pressed the button. Audio filled the studio. A quiet, grainy recording of a voice widely recognized as McConnell's, speaking privately about leveraging impeachment proceedings to ensure Trump never holds power again, not because of the Constitution, but because he's unpredictable. The audio went viral in seconds. Mitch's face tensed, but he said nothing. JD spoke over the chaos. "This is the real Mitch McConnell, not defending democracy, but protecting his own career." The debate descended into a media inferno. Viewers, journalists, and even longtime Republican operatives watched with disbelief. The moment wasn't just viral, it was historic. JD Vance hadn't just exposed a secret. He had turned the lights on in a room no one wanted to admit was dark. What followed was a political reckoning unlike anything modern conservatism had seen. Calls for McConnell's resignation began to swell, not just from fringe elements but from inside the Senate itself. GOP strategists scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late. The images had spread, the audio had burned through digital airwaves, and the narrative had cemented itself in the minds of millions. Mitch McConnell, the once untouchable strategist, had been unmasked. JD Vance's popularity soared. Grassroots supporters rallied in every red state, not just defending Trump, but demanding a full audit of establishment leadership. Trump, now with a louder megaphone than ever, seized the moment. He praised JD in every speech, hinting strongly that Vance would have a major role in the next administration, maybe even more than anyone expected. Behind the scenes, McConnell retreated. His appearances grew fewer, his allies more hesitant, and his command over the Senate less certain. Quietly, donors began to shift their support, and conservative PACs rebranded themselves as America First outlets, distancing from the old guard. In just weeks, the architecture Mitch had built over decades began to crumble. And JD Vance, with one folder and one microphone, had redrawn the lines of power. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a war for the soul of a party, and the people had chosen a new general. The message was clear. No more silence, no more backroom deals, no more pretending. In the new conservative era, exposure was power, and JD Vance had just turned on the spotlight. The clip of JD Vance's shocking live accusation spread like digital wildfire. Within hours, it topped trending lists on every major platform, clips dissected by pundits and parodied by late-night hosts, but the undertone was no longer entertainment, it was alarm. Suddenly, the idea of Mitch McConnell's quiet control was ruptured by the possibility that he had, for decades, orchestrated far more behind the scenes than anyone knew. Talk radio ignited with speculation. Is this the unraveling of the GOP's deepest vault? Callers asked. Online forums buzzed with timelines, matching Vance's claims to historical political shifts and committee outcomes that McConnell had influenced. But what truly stunned the nation wasn't just the substance, it was McConnell's silence. For a man known for his strategic calm and firm responses, he gave none. His team issued a brief written statement calling the allegations absurd and unsubstantiated, but no press conference followed. No interviews. No fiery denial from the Senate floor. It was as if the blow had stunned him into retreat. Meanwhile, JD Vance found himself caught between hero and heretic. Some lauded him for piercing the veil of political hypocrisy, others accused him of fracturing the party from within at the worst possible time. Yet Vance stood his ground, unshaken in subsequent interviews, insisting that silence was complicity and that the American people deserved truth, not theater. Across newsrooms, reporters scrambled to verify the documents Vance had alluded to during the broadcast, those that allegedly linked McConnell to classified committee interference and backchannel negotiations with foreign corporate interests. It was political firestorm incarnate, and while Washington has weathered many, this one had something different, a direct public challenge from within the party's own rising star against its most powerful veteran. Behind closed doors, GOP senators reportedly held emergency meetings, trying to assess whether McConnell was still a viable leader or now a liability. As the week wore on, it became clear that the confrontation had shifted something tectonic. McConnell, once the immovable center of Senate power, now found himself dodging questions, while Vance, young, unapologetic, and ruthless in his pursuit, was suddenly being whispered about as a future leader. And while Trump himself remained relatively quiet, insiders revealed he was extremely pleased with how the tables had turned. In political war, it seemed, silence sometimes spoke louder than attack. As the dust from JD Vance's explosive revelation settled, the aftershocks were just beginning to ripple through the corridors of power. Capitol Hill buzzed with paranoia. Political allies who had once walked shoulder to shoulder with McConnell now avoided eye contact in hallways, uncertain of their own proximity to his alleged misdeeds. Committee chairs convened behind locked doors, debating whether to launch formal inquiries or pretend the incident was mere spectacle. Vance, meanwhile, doubled down. Appearing on every major network, he repeated his claim with cold clarity: the people of this country have been lied to, and I refuse to let the lies continue, no matter who's behind them. With each appearance, his approval ratings surged. What began as a controversial accusation had mutated into a full-fledged political movement, one built not on blind loyalty to Trump or hatred of the establishment, but on raw demand for truth. Grassroots supporters began organizing under the unofficial slogan, "Expose the Rot." T-shirts, podcasts, crowdfunded billboards. Across swing states, Vance's name was suddenly on everyone's lips, not just as a senator, but as a symbol of revolt against the quiet corruption that many Americans had long suspected but couldn't prove. As journalists scrambled to uncover more, a mysterious leak hit the press, a redacted transcript from a closed-door Senate intelligence briefing, heavily implicating McConnell in efforts to suppress whistleblower testimony during the previous administration. While not damning on its own, the timing of the leak seemed to validate Vance's claims. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. News anchors, once skeptical of the young senator's methods, began to entertain the idea that perhaps the rot did, in fact, go deeper than anyone had feared. Meanwhile, McConnell's inner circle began to fracture. His longtime communications director abruptly resigned. A senior aide reportedly began cooperating with investigators. For the first time in decades, McConnell didn't attend his weekly press briefing. Anonymous sources claimed he was deeply rattled. Political analysts speculated that the Senate Majority Leader may not finish his term. Yet even as chaos brewed, Vance remained composed. When asked whether he feared retaliation or political isolation, he responded simply, "If the price of truth is exile from a broken system, I'll pay it." His words resonated far beyond the Beltway. Voters, tired of backroom deals and performative outrage, leaned in. Whether or not McConnell's darkest secret would ever see the light in its entirety remained to be seen. But one thing was clear: JD Vance had cracked open the vault, and the echoes would haunt Washington for years. As public pressure mounted and JD Vance's crusade against hidden corruption gained more momentum, the Senate floor began to feel less like a chamber of governance and more like a stage for political reckoning. The balance of power, once firmly held in McConnell's hands, now teetered as new alliances quietly formed behind closed doors. Senators who once owed their careers to McConnell's influence began to reconsider their loyalties. The whispered conversations in the corridors, the long glances exchanged during committee hearings, everything pointed to a storm brewing within the Republican ranks. JD Vance wasn't acting alone anymore. A small but growing coalition of freshman senators, military veterans, and even a few moderate Democrats began to echo his calls for transparency and accountability. The air was thick with anticipation. Then came a breaking development. A former Senate ethics aide who had worked under McConnell for over a decade came forward with a sworn statement. Her affidavit described a pattern of silencing internal dissent, and detailed a string of manipulated committee assignments and backdoor funding deals. Vance wasted no time. He submitted a motion to establish a special investigative committee, not just into McConnell's actions, but into the broader structure of how political leverage had been abused for decades. Media outlets began digging deeper into the history of McConnell's tenure, rediscovering old controversies, reanalyzing ethics reports, and even pulling financial records of long-forgotten shell organizations linked to campaign donations. The story was no longer about Trump or a canceled impeachment effort. It had evolved into something much larger, a generational showdown between entrenched political power and a new breed of populist disruptors. Cable news exploded with round-the-clock coverage. Protesters gathered outside Senate offices, chanting JD Vance's name. Social media became a war zone of conspiracy, fact-checking, leaks, and fiery commentary. And through it all, Mitch McConnell remained silent. His team issued carefully worded statements, but he himself hadn't been seen in public in over a week. Some speculated he was preparing for a quiet resignation, others feared he was engineering a devastating counter-move. Yet JD Vance remained unshaken. In a viral clip from an impromptu press conference on Capitol Hill, he looked straight into the camera and said, "This isn't personal. This is structural. If we don't clean house now, we won't have a house left to protect." Those words echoed across the country, printed on signs and replayed in digital montages of political awakening. The Washington old guard had underestimated him, and now, for the first time, they were on the defensive. As the Special Investigative Committee was approved with bipartisan support, an outcome few would have predicted even weeks earlier, Washington was thrust into a moment of reckoning that felt both historic and volatile. The corridors of Capitol Hill grew tense with anticipation as subpoenas were issued, documents unsealed, and former aides summoned for testimony. Mitch McConnell, the once untouchable figure of Republican discipline and longevity, was now at the center of a storm that refused to dissipate. JD Vance, often labeled a political outsider, had become the face of a movement that many Americans, especially those disillusioned with traditional power, rallied behind. The deeper the investigation dug, the darker the revelations became. A previously unknown connection was unearthed between a defense contractor and a McConnell-linked PAC that had funneled millions into campaigns over the past decade. Emails hinted at a pay-to-play strategy, where legislative influence was traded for funding, and key defense bills were allegedly crafted not on merit, but on monetary promise. It was the kind of scandal that could rewrite political textbooks, and JD Vance wasn't slowing down. He appeared on every major news outlet, not to gloat, but to warn. "This isn't just about one man," he told viewers. "This is about a machine that's been operating in the shadows for too long." His words resonated with ordinary Americans who had long suspected the game was rigged. Meanwhile, McConnell's allies were split. Some doubled down, defending him as a pragmatic strategist who played by Washington's real rules. Others began distancing themselves, issuing cautious statements about the importance of transparency and ethics in government. The Republican Party, once a monolith under McConnell's guiding hand, was fracturing before the nation's eyes. And Trump, watching from his Florida compound, leveraged every update to reframe himself not as the accused, but as the victim of a larger swamp he'd long claimed to fight. With McConnell wounded and exposed, Trump's supporters cheered Vance as a patriot who had finally cracked open the shell of elitist power. Protests and rallies followed. Some demanded McConnell's resignation, others pushed for full-scale congressional reform. Even Democrats, long at odds with both men, found themselves strangely aligned with parts of Vance's crusade. It was political chaos, but chaos with purpose. As JD Vance prepared to reveal even more findings, hinting at secret recordings and encrypted messages, the Senate chamber braced itself. One truth had become undeniable. The old guard of American politics had been pierced, not by scandal alone, but by a new voice unafraid to call it out live, raw, and unapologetically.